Hello friends, welcome back to our study of Epicureanism and the second part of Lecture 7. In the first part of this lecture we discussed Epicurean physics and epistemology, uncovering how Epicurus's view of a world composed of atoms and void lays the groundwork for his broader philosophical system. On this view there's no special order or teleological design to the universe. For Epicurus, everything occurs by chance. As we saw in the last video, this perspective is marked by a decisive break from the Platonic and Aristotelian traditions, and a focus instead on the material constituents of reality and their random interactions. In this video, we transition to the Epicureans' understanding of psychology, where we'll examine their views on the material foundations of the human soul and its role in sense perception. We'll see how this picture of the psyche presents a stark contrast to the idea of an immortal and immaterial soul that was dominant in Greek mythology and accepted in popular opinion during Epicurus's day. In turning from Epicurus's understanding of physics to his views on psychology, we see a clear continuation of his materialist framework. Central to his understanding of the soul is its physical, material basis. There's no ethereal or purely spiritual soul for Epicurus. Instead, just like everything else in the universe, the soul has a material composition. And yes, you've guessed it, it's composed of atoms. But these aren't just any atoms, they are minuscule and refined, allowing for the soul's unique properties and experiences. You can observe this in Epicurus's letter to Herodotus, specifically sections 63 to 67, where he examines the soul's primary role in facilitating our sense perceptions. Significantly, although the soul has a most fundamental role for Epicurus in our experience of the world, he denies that this means it can exist independently from the body after death. Its functions are inextricably tied to our corporeal existence. So Epicurus rejects the idea of an immaterial soul. Now, you might wonder, how then does Epicurus think the soul interacts with the body? How exactly does it facilitate our experiences and perceptions? As a helpful analogy here, you can think of the Epicurean soul as comparable to our nervous system. Just as the nervous system is a complex corporeal web of nerves that permeates our entire body and mediates our sensations and responses, the Epicurean soul is a kind of body made up of fine atomic particles distributed through our entire being. As Epicurus puts it in his letter to Herodotus, the soul is a body made up of fine parts distributed throughout the entire aggregate of the rest of the body. The crucial point here is that the soul, while responsible for our sense perceptions, is just like our nervous system in that it cannot exist independently from the body. It's necessarily linked to our material existence. Now, one of the implications of this view of psychology is another core Epicurean tenet, for it requires that we deny that the soul is immortal. While many of his fellow Greeks believed in an ever-living soul that persists beyond death, Epicurus was clear: the soul cannot exist apart from the rest of the body. According to this view, what happens to my soul when I die is that the atoms constituting myself simply disperse into the void. My unity and coherence as a self dissolve, marking a definitive end to conscious existence. This view has further important implications, especially when we consider beliefs about the afterlife. For if Epicurus is right, then one of the central beliefs of most religious worldviews, in his time and in ours, is false. There's no heaven or hell that awaits us following death, no reincarnation or spiritual continuation. Death is not a gateway to another existence, but a cessation of being. Throughout its history, Epicureanism has therefore had a great deal to say against traditional approaches to religion that promote the idea of an immortal soul and beliefs about divine judgment after death. But what about the divine itself? Did Epicurus in his day also deny the existence of the gods? As a materialist about being, you would think so. But in fact, contrary to expectations, Epicurus was not an atheist. His belief in the gods is rooted in his empiricism. How so? Well, in his letter to Menesius, in section 123, Epicurus asserts that all our conceptual beliefs are based on sense perception, and he applies this principle even to our belief in a divine power. His argument here is intriguing. If the gods did not exist, we would not have any conception of them. Yet, across all human cultures, there appears to be what Epicurus calls a basic grasp of the gods, a universal notion of something divine. This must have come from somewhere, but the only place it could have come from is sense perception, and sense perception is always true and reliable, according to Epicurus. Thus, he concludes, the gods must exist. However, Epicurus then goes on to challenge traditional views of the gods in his time. The man who denies the gods of the many is not impious, he says, but rather he who ascribes to the gods the opinions of the many. Epicurus is arguing here that any belief we have about the gods has to be consistent with how the gods appear to us in their fundamental nature. And the most fundamental perception of any god, our basic grasp of a god, is that it's a perfect and self-sufficient being. To be perfect and self-sufficient, the gods cannot be troubled or concerned with how we act. If they were, this would imply that they need us in some way, which would mean that they are not perfect and self-sufficient. Epicurus concludes that the gods must then exist apart from human affairs, in a perfectly blessed state that's indifferent to what we do. This conception of the gods is in stark contrast to the anthropomorphic and interventionist deities that were common in Greek mythology and that feature in many religious traditions even today. The gods of most world religions interact with humans and often determine or influence our fate, passing judgment on us as we live and bestowing rewards or punishment after death. According to the Epicurean view, by contrast, the gods are not concerned with us, nor do they reward or punish us. And since they don't care about us, we don't need to care about them. This leads to Epicurus' first piece of advice about how we should live. We have nothing to fear with respect to the gods. It's a revolutionary idea for its implications because it suggests that our motivations for acting ethically should not be rooted in fear of divine retribution or any hope for divine favor. Epicurean ethics instead is grounded in human experiences and needs, not in pleasing or gratifying the gods. And again, this view represents a significant departure from the conventional religious beliefs of Epicurus' time and even challenges most modern notions of divinity. It reflects Epicurus' commitment to empirical evidence and rational inference, extending even to matters of religion and theology. By redefining the nature of the gods and their relationship to human life, Epicurus looked to free ethics from supernatural considerations, focusing instead on the practical aspects of achieving contentment and happiness. So that's Epicurus' first basic claim in ethics. His empirical approach to theology and his views on the gods' indifference to human affairs lead to a liberating conclusion. Our ethical choices and pursuit of the good life are not connected to divine expectations or retribution. This perspective is a vital part of a larger ethical framework for the Epicureans, known as the tetrapharmakon, the fourfold remedy or drug, a set of 4 key principles that are the cornerstone of Epicurean ethics. The first principle of the tetrapharmakon, don't fear God, encourages freedom from the anxiety of divine judgment. The second principle, don't worry about death, is a principle that builds on Epicurus' materialist understanding of the soul. The third principle, what's good is easy to get, is a claim that advocates for a life where natural and necessary desires are easily fulfilled. And the fourth principle, what's terrible is easy to endure, tells us that the pains that we often fear are either bearable or not as lasting as we imagine and can be overcome. We'll examine the third and fourth claims of the tetrapharmakon in more detail in the next lecture. For the rest of this lecture, we'll focus on the second. Don't worry about death. Like Epicurus' first ethical principle, don't worry about the gods, his second provides guidance on liberating ourselves from common fears. He tells us here that we have nothing to fear with respect to death, a view discussed in sections 124 to 125 of his letter to Menesius. But why shouldn't we fear death, according to Epicurus? his reasoning is tied closely to his views on the material composition of the soul. Since the soul, composed of atoms, disperses at death, there's no self remaining to perceive or experience anything. Death, then, is simply the cessation of sensation and consciousness. As Epicurus famously states, death, the most frightening of bad things, is nothing to us, since when we exist, death is not yet present, and when death is present, then we do not exist. Therefore, it's relevant neither to the living nor to the dead, since it does not affect the former, and the latter do not exist. Or as he puts it even more succinctly in the Principal Doctrines, a text we'll consider in the next lecture, death is nothing to us, for what has been dissolved has no sense experience, and what has no sense experience is nothing to us. The fact that there'll be no self that exists at the point of death eliminates the possibility of experiencing anything after we die, rendering the fear of death irrational. Reading these first two ethical claims alongside each other, we find that the first dispels the fear of divine judgment, while the second frees us from the dread of death. Combined, the claims look to provide a cure for common worries and anxieties. But let's linger some more here on Epicurus's advice against fearing death. Epicurus's approach to death can be seen as the original YOLO philosophy. It emphasizes that we have only one life to live, and since worrying about death is in a way a longing for more life, Epicurus considers this fear unhealthy. Why? Because for Epicurus, the good life is about living well with what we have, not about yearning for an unattainable immortality. As we'll see in the next lecture, when we move on further to his views in ethics, Epicurus believes that a life devoted to the satisfaction of limitless desires is a life filled with distress and anxiety, and a longing to keep living is the epitome of a limitless desire. Now, it would be a mistake to conclude from this philosophy that death is something we should actively pursue. Epicurus's denial that death is a bad thing does not imply that death is a good thing. The claim instead is that death is something that's neither good nor bad. As an empiricist, Epicurus holds that we can only judge something to be good or bad on the basis of sense perception. But at the point of death, not only am I no longer capable of perceiving, I'm no longer me. So death is, quite literally, nothing to me. On this view, death isn't something to be rejected or embraced. As Epicurus puts it in his letter to Menesius, the many sometimes flee death as the greatest of bad things, and sometimes choose it as a relief from the bad things in life. But the wise man neither rejects life nor fears death. What the Epicurean sage rejects, by acknowledging the mortality of the human soul, are groundless, anxiety-inducing fears about death. Instead, they embrace the finite nature of their existence, leading to a healthy appreciation of the pleasures and joys of life. But now let's dig deeper into Epicurus's reasons against fearing death by considering some challenges to this view. Epicurus's argument here depends on the premise that for something to qualify as a harm, it must be something we can experience. It follows that since we cannot experience death, death cannot be something that harms us. Death cannot hurt me because there'll be no me to feel pain when I die. This is a simple and compelling argument, but here are two possible ways to object. The first objection leans into Epicurean empiricism and points out that fears about death are generally connected with the process of dying and the deterioration of one's physical and cognitive abilities, which often includes pain and mental and emotional distress. These are things we experience. They are directly perceivable and therefore undeniably real according to Epicurus's empiricism. When we talk about fear of death, what we're afraid of isn't the experience of being dead, but the experience of dying. How might Epicurus respond? He could concede that the process of dying can be painful and distressing, but he would likely emphasize that this is a part of life, not death. He could argue that by understanding the natural process of dying, and by cultivating a balanced life that prioritizes our physical and mental health, we can reduce the fear and anxiety associated with dying. Further, Epicurus could say that the anticipation of pain is often worse than the pain itself, and that by living in the present and not fixating on the future, we can alleviate much of the fear associated with the dying process. A second objection to Epicurus's view of death challenges the basic premise that for something to be harmful, we must be able to experience it. Consider here the value of future experiences. The premature death of a talented individual is often seen as tragic, not just for the loss experienced by their loved ones, but for the unfulfilled potential of the person who dies. We mourn the unrealized possibilities, the relationships unformed, the books unwritten, the discoveries unmade. This suggests that harm can occur even if the deceased cannot experience it, challenging Epicurus's view that only experiential harms matter. Epicurus could respond, however, by questioning the assumption that unfulfilled potential is inherently tragic or harmful. He could argue that while it's natural to feel sorrow for what might have been, this doesn't really constitute a harm to the deceased. Epicurus could also emphasize that dwelling on potential future achievements can lead to unnecessary anxiety and detract from the enjoyment of the life we have to live. By focusing on living well in the moment, he would argue, we can lead a fulfilling life without being burdened by the fear of what we might not achieve. Ultimately, Epicurus's philosophy invites us to reconsider our relationship with death and the future. By accepting the limits of our existence and embracing the present, he believes, we can find contentment and peace, free from anxieties about what we don't yet have. And that's the end of Lecture 7. In this video, we've discussed Epicurus's views on the materiality and mortality of the human soul. We've seen how he holds that the soul is composed of atoms. Importantly, the soul is not immortal, according to this view. It disperses at death, marking the end of consciousness. Next, we explored the role of the soul as the facilitator of sense perception. Like our nervous system, the soul permeates our entire body, enabling our experiences and responses to the world. We then introduced the tetrapharmakon, or the fourfold remedy, which is central to Epicurean ethics. This set of principles provides guidance on how to live a content and tranquil life. The first principle, that we have nothing to fear when it comes to the gods, encourages freedom from the anxiety of divine judgment. Epicurus believes in the existence of gods on empirical grounds, but he argues that they're indifferent to human affairs. They don't care about us, so we don't have to care about them. The second principle, that we have nothing to fear when it comes to death, encourages us to live the one life we have as best we can. We also considered objections to Epicurus's views on death by discussing the fear of dying and the value of future experiences, and how an Epicurean could respond to these concerns. In the next lecture of this unit, we'll move on to further pieces of guidance Epicurus puts forward in living the best life we can, focusing on the third and fourth principles of the tetrapharmakon. You'll also begin next week a set of philosophical exercises where you'll get to live like an Epicurean by putting these principles into practice. I'm eager to hear how that goes.